By the mid-1980s, Ireland's first wave of drug barons had been put away. Larry Dunn and 8 members of his family were inside.
8 have been convicted for crimes related to heroin.
Michael Dunn, known as Mickey Dazzler, was caught with heroin in his flat and got 7 years. His wife Dolores, now trying to break her heroin habit, got a 2-year suspended sentence. Well, it's certainly true to say that the Dunns were pivotal. They weren't as big as the people who came after them some way down the line, but they certainly organised networks. So they set up trails which others could use and tap into. Part of their downfall was that while they were pivotal, they were never able to get big enough to distance themselves completely from their operations. So that when Larry was finally caught, he was caught with heroin and other drugs in his own house. This would not have happened to some of the big guys further down the line.
The scene was about to change, and so was the cast.
The fact that we have taken out a lot of the bigger fish has meant that a lot of small criminals are now thinking big. In the aftermath of the breaking up of the Dunn family of drug dealers, what then took place was a fragmentation on the crime scene in Dublin. We had a multiplicity of gangs, perhaps as many as 40 different gangs located all over the city, who saw this as an opportunity for them to get involved in the drug trade. And they did that.
The men who would rise to the top, the likes of George Mitchell, John Cunningham and John Gilligan, had all ran and robbed with the Dunns. In the late 80s, while in prison, they had time to study the rise and fall of Larry Dunn and his brothers and learn from their mistakes.
Gangs normally come from blood relationships, from localized areas in the neighborhood that they come from, or sometimes they've served time in prison. Bonds of friendship are forged there. They assure each other they will hatch a wonderful plan to go and do highly profitable crime, and next time they won't get caught.
Behind bars in Portlaoise, the next big player would turn out to be John Gilligan.
Hey, John, hey, look around here now, John Gilligan. Oh, he's about 14 feet. Oh, he's gone down to 5'6". Oh, he's gone up to another 14 feet.
Factory John from Ballyfermot, a small-time crook who had specialised in warehouse jobs. On the landings and in the exercise yard, he would put together the nucleus of a new gang with a game plan to fill the void and get rich quick.
Brian, by God, Brian's playing very well here today. Well done, Brian.
Essentially, John Gilligan and his main lieutenants served sentences in Portlaoise prison together.
Right, take a shot.
Now, these lieutenants turned out to be quite loyal to John Gilligan. Unlike some of the gangs which followed, loyalty was not a big issue.
Up to Paul Ward.
But in the Gilligan gang, these individuals, there was about 6 of them, and they were very, very loyal.
Oh, referee. Yellow card. Send him off.
Gilligan's Praetorian Guard would include Brian Meehan, Peter Mitchell and Paul Ward.
John Gilligan, when he came out of prison, identified a niche in the market. He decided that cannabis resin would be his business. He decided that for a number of reasons. One was that he felt that by operating in the area of cannabis resin, that he wouldn't be as big a target for law enforcement as if he was dealing in heroin. He also saw that there were more people in this country using cannabis resin, and the people who were using cannabis resin had more money to spend on that drug. It was the beginnings of the Celtic Tiger era.
The Gilligan gang brought drug trafficking in this country to another level. They brought a business-like structure to their empire. They dealt directly with associates on the continent. They bought in bulk. They had a sophisticated logistic and distribution network.
One of the first things that we noticed was the extent of the operation and the size of the pyramid which John Gilligan, as headman, had created. Between May of 1994 and October of 1996, street value of cannabis which they brought in was in excess of £200 million at that time.
There are phenomenal profits to be made in drug importation and marketing, as we know, and what Larry Dunn was making was nothing at all in comparison to what John Gilligan was making at that point.
The outward signs of that wealth was the house in Jessbrook and the trappings that were there, the equestrian centre, and how he was able to develop that and buy and pay for that and put all the best equipment and furniture into it. I think that's indicative of how wealthy he was.
The profits were so excessive that sometimes we had difficulty in reporting the amounts for the simple reason that those above us in authority would have seen us as building empires, exaggerating the problem in order to get more resources. Some of it, frankly, once you got into the millions, was quite unbelievable.
I would have to say that on my desk in the Department of Justice, did organised crime feature largely? No, it didn't. What featured largely during all of that time and all the high files that I had were, you know, the Provos, the INLA, the UVF, and the focus of the government and the focus of the Commissioner and the focus of the Department of Justice was all on paramilitary violence because we were going through terrible times during that period.
To come out and say that a two-bit Dublin criminal from one of the poor areas of the city was now dealing in millions in Holland and was back and forth and had an army of drug dealers was quite unbelievable. And they would take convincing, and did take convincing at a certain point.
None of us realised at the time, certainly I didn't realise, the extent to which this kind of crime was going to grow and how the bubble was going to burst and how everything that has happened since in the whole organised crime area was going to develop.
The extent of the crime in Dublin City particularly is just alarming, and the inability of the guards, because of the legislation, to really do anything about it or to properly address it is something that has to be publicised. Now, when we do it, we're effectively bringing pressure onto the criminals, and either by guards or by legislation, and they just don't like it. I'm not the only crime reporter that, you know, does this, and I think that the regrettable thing is that we're all probably targets, unfortunately.
In 1995, when Veronica Guerin attempted to question John Gilligan about his vast wealth, he beat her up. She later pressed assault charges, and in June 1996, Gardaí believed John Gilligan had her assassinated to prevent her testifying against him in court.
It's in the aftermath of something horrendous having taken place that you will be listened to. Until that has happened, you're not likely to be taken too seriously because there are so many other issues and problems vying for attention and for scarce resources. Everything changed after Veronica Guerin. Politicians for the first time realised that this is a very serious problem.
Nobody is untouchable, and the government is absolutely determined that whoever ordered this murder will, sooner or later, and I hope sooner, face charges in our courts.
When that happened, the whole system was shocked from top to bottom. And you had one of those plateau points when there was a consensus from the Supreme Court across to the guards and back into the Dáil and across into the media that, you know, whatever had to be done would be done and that everybody would uphold everybody else's decision.
There was a realisation, this is a step too far. Now the focus of attention is going to be on organised crime, and they are going to regret the day that this happened.
For the first time, the apparatus of the state was now fully focused on organised crime. The Criminal Assets Bureau was set up to go after the ill-gotten gains of Ireland's leading criminals. John Gilligan and his mob was the first target. At the same time, the team investigating the murder of Veronica Guerin was probing the gang and seeking to exploit any weak links in the pyramid.
In 1996, I was seconded to the Veronica Guerin investigation as a detective inspector, sort of in charge of the incident room out there. It took actually 400 arrests to get the full degree of information from this pyramid. We never really came to terms with the individuals who were in Portlaoise prison with him. They did not talk. They remained loyal right to the end. But because of the size of the operation, he also recruited people who were not actually hardcore criminals. You're talking about Charlie Bowden, who was basically an army man. You're talking about Russell Warren, who had some minor criminal convictions. And you're talking about a storeman in Cork, John Dunn. When they came into custody, they had remorse, which none of the other guys had. And through this, then, we were able to obtain details of the entire organisation. And this was the dismantling of the organisation from within.
Combined international police pressure on John Gilligan's organisation finally paid off. On October the 6th, 1996, he was arrested in Heathrow Airport with a case containing over £300,000 in cash. Gilligan fought his extradition to Ireland for nearly 3.5 years before he exhausted every legal loophole.
Two detectives from Lucan, Thomas O'Loughlin and Michael Murray, escorted the 47-year-old Dublin man back to Ireland.
On February the 3rd, 2000, John Gilligan arrived at Baldonnel to finally face Irish justice. He was eventually given 20 years for drug trafficking offences and had all his trophy possessions seized. His chief lieutenant, Brian Meehan, is serving life for the murder of Veronica Guerin and lost his assets. The rest of the gang were either jailed or went on the run. In total, over €10 million was confiscated from them. The toppling of the Gilligan network created yet another vacuum in Irish organised crime. The major players scurried abroad with as much loot as they could carry to regroup and rebuild.
Post the decline or demise of the Gilligan gang, you had almost a flight of other experienced drug traffickers to Europe. That was where they could prosper. That was where they had their contacts, where they needed to be in terms of organising distribution, logistics, finance, etc.
A number of the really experienced criminals in the Dublin area, I'm talking about Georgie Mitchell, I'm talking about Christy Kinahan, and I'm talking about John Cunningham. They made a conscious decision to take up position abroad in Holland, in Amsterdam, in Spain, different places, and just act as facilitators. They were still taking their cut from the importation of drugs, but they had a much better chance of securing their funding abroad and keeping it abroad. They were all quite afraid of the Criminal Assets Bureau and its powers to seize their assets.
It left here in Ireland somewhat of a vacuum, and into that vacuum came other smaller groups, keen to make a name for themselves, but ruthless in their approach. These